This story is about something that happened in my family around 10 years ago. My brother Pat was married to a woman named Kelly. They had a tumultuous relationship. It was known in the family that Kelly had an affair in the past with her boss. News travels fast in our family. Pat did eventually forgive her, and they moved forward with their marriage for a time. While that was happening, they had a new house under construction. Maybe that was part of the reason they worked through it. The house was eventually finished, and soon after that, Pat and Kelly moved in. It was a 2-story, 4-bedroom house in a new development. One of those places where all the houses look exactly the same. I will admit that it was a really fabulous place once you get past the lack of character. I'm not one to criticize anyway, because I was living in a sparsely furnished 1-bedroom apartment at the time. Pat had his own contracting company, and he was also really handy with many other trades, including carpentry. He had the house built with the basement unfinished because he wanted to do some work on it himself as a project. He had a whole plan for what it was supposed to look like, but for the time being, it was nothing but concrete and exposed pipes. He planned to put a full bathroom down there, and in order to do that, he would have to open a sizable hole in the concrete floor of the basement. He'd need to do that in order to hook up the plumbing for the toilet and the shower. I went over to help him with some of the grunt work one time. I'm not handy in that way. I work in tech, so this was really his world. When I got there and saw what he did, I was really surprised, because the hole he'd opened up in the concrete was much larger than I was expecting. He'd rented a jackhammer for the day, and must have taken out a 3x4-foot hole right down into the dirt. I would have thought that doing something like that would cause problems with the foundation, maybe cause water damage or something, but like I said, it's not my domain. We spent a few hours cleaning up the mess left by the work that Pat had done with the jackhammer. After we were done with that, I asked him how things were going with Kelly. He told me they were still having some problems. We discussed it for half an hour or so. Eventually, I asked him if she'd been unfaithful again, but he wouldn't answer. I don't remember a whole lot of the details of the conversation, but I left feeling that Pat was holding something back. He seemed very guarded about the details of their relationship. That was strange for him, because we were really close, and we often had deep conversations of that nature. When I went to bed that night, I had some trouble sleeping because something was off with my brother. It bothered me more and more as I thought about it. A few days later, Pat asked me to come back and help with the work in the basement. When I got there, the giant hole in the floor was filled with new concrete. There were a few pipes sticking out, and I figured they were meant to hook up the toilet and sink. It actually looked really good, and I felt kind of silly for questioning my brother's work before. I helped him carry some things down the stairs to the basement. He had bought a toilet, a sink, and some other things. We brought them down and placed them next to the filled hole. I then tried to start another conversation about Kelly and their relationship, but this time, Pat was having none of it. He shut it down before it started, and I respected that. I didn't mean to pry, but like I said before, it was normal for Pat and I to talk about things like that, so I didn't think it was a big deal. Next, I simply asked Pat where Kelly was. It was a Saturday, so she would normally be home. When I asked that, Pat completely freaked out on me. He started yelling and accused me of being too nosy. To be fair to him, I should have picked up on the hint before. However, the anger in his eyes was something I hadn't seen in him before. I really seemed to have struck a nerve, and I have a hard time believing that it was just my questions that troubled him. I went home that night disturbed by what happened between us. I was really confused because I'd never seen my brother like that before. I was worried for the next few days. After what happened before, I was hesitant to even contact Pat again, but I didn't have to. He called me. We talked on the phone for a few minutes. He apologized for what happened before, and when he did, I could hear that he was distressed. After only a few minutes, Pat told me that Kelly left him. When he got back from work, she was simply gone, with no explanation. We talked for another few minutes, and then I hung up the phone. I figured that Kelly must have gone to her parents' house, but she didn't. I later found out that Kelly's parents had reported her missing shortly after my conversation with Pat. The police interviewed him, but nothing came of it. He told them what he told me, simply that he came home one day and she was gone. A few years later, Kelly was never found. My relationship with Pat deteriorated after that because I suspect that he was involved with her disappearance. I can't get my mind off that hole in the basement. It was easily large enough to fit a body, and the timing is impossible to ignore. Opinions are divided in my family, and it's caused a serious rift. Pat sold the house years ago. Someday, I want to buy it, so I can open up that floor in the basement. Then I can find out for sure whether or not my brother is a murderer. This all happened around 5 years ago. I had just moved to a new city with my family, and we recently bought a new house. New to us, anyway. My wife and I had 3 sons at the time. We still do, actually. They were 9, 7, and 4 years old at the time. My 2 older sons were already in school, but my youngest son, Jamie, was still staying at home. That was fine because I worked from home, so I could take care of him. We would send him to daycare sometimes, but sometimes he would stay home with me. The house was not new. It was built in the 1960s, and it was vacant for several years before we bought it. I've always liked older houses as opposed to newer ones. This place had high ceilings and beautiful woodwork on the baseboards and door frames. You just don't see that kind of craftsmanship in newer places these days. There were 2 full stories and a large backyard. Even though I loved the character of the house, it did need some work. There were some serious issues with the pipes and plumbing throughout, and only 1 toilet was working when we moved in. It was the washroom on the main floor, so I would have to go all the way downstairs if I needed to use the bathroom at night. Not the end of the world, but I was eager to get it fixed. I had hired a plumber to take a look at the upstairs toilet. We were expecting him to come by during the day when I was working. Jamie was going to be home that day as well. It was around noon. I had just finished having lunch, and Jamie was upstairs having his nap. I usually take an hour for lunch, but I don't need nearly that amount of time just to eat. I usually go outside and get some fresh air around that time of day. I went out to the backyard and grabbed a few bags of leaves to take them up to the front of the house. As I was walking around the side, I noticed a white van pull up. There was a large tree and some bushes in my way, but I was pretty sure it was the plumber who I was waiting for. I put the leaves down so I could go to let him in. When I made my way there, I realized the van didn't have any markings on it. Usually the plumbing companies have their logo or something on the van so that you know it's them. Just then, I turned back to the house, and I was horrified to see that the front door was wide open. Someone had broken in. I sprinted in there shouting. I don't even remember what I was saying. I just remember the feeling of fear. I ran up the stairs to make sure Jamie was safe. When I got into his room, a tremendous feeling of relief washed over me. Jamie was fast asleep in his crib. The intruder hadn't made it to him. I looked out the window at that moment, and I saw the white van speed away from the house. I guess he must have heard me and ran away. I dialed the police right away, but I never left Jamie's side, just in case they came back. I kept looking out the window, and eventually a police car pulled up. I walked down the stairs shaking and let him in. We discussed the incident for a few minutes. Unfortunately, I didn't see the intruder, and I didn't see the license plate either. Because of that, I wasn't able to give the cops much to go on, and the guy was never caught. When we checked the house, we found out that my wife's laptop, which was on the living room table, was missing, so we figured it was meant to be a robbery. Obviously, I was worried that they were after Jamie, but it's probably not what that was about. This was not the kind of neighborhood where you would expect something like that, and nothing similar has happened since. When I was around 9 years old, I used to spend many days playing with my cousins. Tatiana and I were the same age, and we were the oldest. The youngest was Serena, who was 5 years old. Tatiana would be my friend throughout our school years, and even though we don't see each other very often today, we're still reasonably close. We used to like common children's games like hide and seek, but we also loved horror stories. They were still living in a house that was allegedly haunted, and I have a few stories about our time there. However, this won't be one of them. because at that time, her parents were building what would be their new house in another neighborhood. It was in that half-finished building where this episode took place. The walls were already up, but there were no doors or windows in the frames, and not even plaster on the bricks. It was a medium-sized house with 2 bedrooms. There were neighbors on the left, but on the right, just an empty lot with a cornfield. It was a very quiet street, and this happened at dusk. The summer sky was clear, and the moonlight was already very bright through the non-existent ceiling. The 3 of us were playing hide-and-seek in the building. My mother and aunt were at the front of the house talking under a tree. My father and uncle were in a little tool shed at the back of the lot. We'd gone through each room countless times that afternoon, and even earlier, when my aunt had shown us every detail. There was no one else in the entire property. It was fenced in, and there's no way anybody could get in without being seen by my parents or my aunt and uncle. So on what would be the last round of hide-and-seek of the night, I was completely certain that I would only find my cousins inside, huddled in some dark corner or behind a pillar. They would be waiting to freak me out and run to the starting point. It was quite dark, and in the bluish half-light, I could still see the walls and corridors, but the corners were already completely darkened. I was walking down the hall between the kitchen and what would be the girls' room when I heard a muffled giggle. At the same time, I felt a smile break out because my older cousin had hid really well, and I was really proud to have found her so easily. As I cautiously approached the bedroom, I saw Tatiana with her back to the door. It was a strange sight because we'd usually crouch down to hide, but she was standing on her feet. A chill ran down my spine when I realized that she was whispering something to herself. Also, her posture was unnaturally rigid and erect for a child at play, so I tried to call her. "Tatiana, what are you doing?" But she didn't even move. Then I heard Serena screaming outside that my mother was calling me to leave. I felt terribly uneasy because I instantly remembered something that my grandfather used to say about spirits and apparitions. He was a very stoic and religious man, and his stories were especially frightening because he told them extremely seriously, as if he wanted to forewarn us and not to entertain us. I never even saw my grandfather smile, which says a lot about his personality. Despite that, he'd always been my favorite relative, and there in the dim light in front of my cousin's bizarre behavior, it was as if his words still touched me deeply, preventing me from entering the room and simply shaking Tatiana. He used to say, if you meet someone you know, or even just anyone, and they don't respond to you inexplicably, don't try to get closer. I felt my whole body trembling, and I wanted to get out of there, because I heard the calls outside from my younger cousin, and also the laughter from the adults saying goodbye. But the air was very heavy, and I couldn't look away from that window that was increasingly brighter against the darkness of the night. That figure identical to Tatiana seemed oblivious to my presence, even though I'm sure my breathing was audible to her. She didn't move, but I could feel her waiting for something. I felt like there wouldn't be a face when she turned to me, and that her movements wouldn't be human. My grandfather's words were mixed with sounds of distant voices. They aren't people. Then I felt a hand on my shoulder, which made me jump in fright. It was my cousin Tatiana, who was behind me and was looking at the same point that I was, at the thing. She whispered, "Do you see her too?" I nodded at Tatiana's completely terrified gaze. Then I turned my attention back to the figure at the window. Then things happened very quickly, seconds maybe. Tatiana made a move to enter the room, but I held her tightly and prevented her from doing so. Something told me that if she went in, that thing would recognize us immediately. The moment that I took Tatiana by the arm, my little cousin, my mother, and even my aunt appeared, talking loudly, and demanding to know why I didn't go outside. Of course, we both immediately turned to face the arriving group, pulling our gaze away from the thing. And even more obvious, neither of us saw it anymore when we turned back. However, Serena entered the room, running to the window. It was as if she'd seen something. Eventually, we all left the building, and upon reporting what we saw to our guardians, we received the full and expected disbelief. Also, inconsistencies appeared between my account and Tatiana's, when we realized that we'd seen different figures at the window. I saw someone identical to her, and she saw an old woman with gray hair. To this day, we still occasionally comment on the incident, and to this day, we both maintain the description of what we saw, unchanged. Serena, unfortunately, has no recollection of the incident, and when asked what she saw on that occasion, hoping it would set the facts straight, she claimed to see a man, which was even more bizarre. I always imagined that what we saw had been a doppelganger spirit. When I read some skinwalker stories, I laughed because I previously associated them with some clearly fictional creepypastas. But now when I return to those buildings in the bluish twilight, I see unexpected similarities.